I want to focus on Iran for a second. I think when we talk about success, right, success is Iran is no longer pursuing nuclear weapons. Success is that the uranium they have is gone, and it's fulfilling 30 or 40 years of U.S. policy, right? That's success. Do you agree with that?
I mean, ultimately, we did it for a reason. We don't want there to be a nuclear-armed Iran.
So, look, Iran can make whatever pledges they want. It's not worth the paper it's written on. But making sure the nuclear dust is out, making sure the facilities that they have underground are gone, that is success. And I assume you would agree that any deal that you think the president should sign or not sign has to address those core issues.
Absolutely. So the removal of highly enriched uranium is an irreversible step. You remove it or you destroy it, it's not there anymore. On enrichment, those are limits, but if you're not inspecting it, they can always violate it. And as long as they have the equipment and the know-how, they could always violate it in the future as well. So that would have to be, that's the one that would have to be monitored. But the enrichment you could verify immediately because you either have it or you don't.
Yeah, I think you have to dismantle what's there and you have to get out what's there. I think that's the most critical piece because, Iran has survived multiple administrations. That's their whole goal. Their whole goal is just run out the clock. They've run out the clock previously. And so the idea that they'll pledge to do something in the future, I just don't think we can trust that. Once we pull away the military, once we move on to another topic, their pledge is kind of irrelevant. Getting what's there
at a Senate hearing in Washington, D.C.,
I think has to be the most important thing.
Exchange suddenly
Otherwise,
turned
it's
into
hard to
something
convince, I
much
think, the
bigger
American
than
people.
a policy discussion.
Because when Senator Moskowitz looked at Mr. Secretary and said success on Iran means the uranium is gone, the underground facilities are gone, and 30 or 40 years of American policy finally means something, he was not asking for a slogan. He was asking whether the United States is still serious enough to tell the difference between a promise and a result. And that is the question every American should be asking right now. Do we want national security built on verified facts, or do we want to gamble it on signatures from regimes that have spent decades learning how to wait us out? Because, come on, if your neighbor has broken into your house 3 times, you do not call it progress because he promises to knock next time.
That was the frame of this hearing, and it matters. Senator Moskowitz was not performing outrage for a camera.
He was laying down a basic standard. Iran cannot simply pledge its way out of a nuclear crisis.
Mr. Secretary agreed on the core point, saying Iran's pledges are not worth the paper they are written on, and that removal of highly enriched uranium is an irreversible step. That line right there is the entire case.
Because once the uranium is removed or destroyed, it is not sitting in a tunnel waiting for the next administration, the next distraction, or the next weak deal.
But notice what was also not said. Nobody pretended trust was enough. Nobody said diplomatic language could replace inspections, dismantlement, and actual removal. Nobody acted like Iran's long game was some mystery. Senator Moskowitz said it plainly. Iran has survived multiple administrations by running out the clock, and if America moves on, their pledge becomes almost irrelevant.
We talked a lot about critical minerals. I think the administration is doing a really good job on critical minerals, these rare minerals that we need for our military, for technology. But I don't think the American people understand how important it really is and what China is doing around the world. I mean, do you think the administration could do a slightly better job on educating the American people why this is so important and why they should care about that?
Yeah, I think we all need to do a better job. And I started talking about this issue when I was in the U.S. Senate, but frankly, it's not sexy. You have to explain it to people because they have to understand that you can build the greatest car in the world. You can build the greatest plane in the world. You can build the greatest weapons system in the world, and you can build the greatest technology and infrastructure in the world. If it's missing one little thing, one chip, one element that you need to build it, if it's missing that, the whole thing doesn't work. You can't do it. Yeah. I think back to the magnets that are critical to the cars, and when the Chinese cut us off and the world off of those magnets that they were producing for cars, no, I wasn't even that conversant in the issue before it happened. So I think there are vulnerabilities like that. We've mapped out those vulnerabilities. I would agree. I think this is going to require a sustained public campaign to tell people when we talk about critical minerals what we're actually talking about and why it's important.
And I think that's right. And I think people don't understand exactly the long game that China is playing. And I think it's important for U.S. foreign policy around the world.
That is prosecutorial exhibit number 1. A hostile regime does not need to defeat America in one dramatic moment.
It just needs America to get bored, distracted, divided, and tired. And if that happens, the failure will not arrive with sirens. It will arrive dressed up as diplomacy, stamped with polite language, and sold to the public as success.
Now we move into prosecutorial mode, because this is the part where the hearing stops sounding like a normal policy exchange and starts looking like a political stress test.
And yes, this is where every viewer has to choose a side, not in some cheap cable news way. Not because a party logo magically makes someone right, but because the question sitting in that hearing room is brutally simple. Do you stand with the side that says Iran must be stripped of highly enriched uranium, dismantled, inspected, and denied the ability to run out the clock again? Or do you stand with the side that still believes hostile regimes can be managed with paper promises, soft language, and another round of diplomatic theater? That is the divide.
Republicans look at Iran and say, remove the uranium, destroy the capability, dismantle what exists, verify every inch of it, and stop pretending a signature from Tehran is a security guarantee. Democrats too often want to talk like the act of negotiating itself is the victory.
But negotiation is not victory.
A press conference is not victory.
A pledge from Iran is not victory.
Victory is when the material is gone, the facilities are gone, and the threat cannot quietly wait for the next administration to fall asleep.
Senator Moskowitz forced that standard into the room. He said success means Iran is no longer pursuing nuclear weapons. Success means the uranium they have is gone. Success means 30 or 40 years of American policy finally reaches the only conclusion that actually matters. And Mr. Secretary, to his credit, did not dodge the core fact. He admitted that Iran's pledges are not worth the paper they are written on, and that removing highly enriched uranium is an irreversible step because once it is removed or destroyed, it is not there anymore. That is the receipt.
That is the line that exposes every weak argument around this issue. Because if Iran keeps the equipment, keeps the know-how, keeps the underground infrastructure, and only promises not to use it, then America has not secured anything.
America has only rented temporary silence.
And temporary silence is not national security.
It is delay dressed up as strategy. That is why viewers need to decide what kind of politics they actually believe in. Do you want the Republican standard where a threat is not neutralized until the capability is physically removed? Or do you want the Democratic establishment standard where officials can walk out, say the words framework, understanding, and progress, and expect the American people to clap while the real danger remains underground? Come on. If a man breaks into your house, you do not celebrate because he promises to stand outside next time. You change the locks. You remove the weapon. You make sure he cannot do it again. That same logic applies to Iran.
On my algorithm or anyone else's algorithm here or the kids in college, there's nothing about the Ukraine-Russia war, about the hundreds of thousands of people that are dead in that war, or the 25,000 people that were kids that were kidnapped, or all the kids that were killed in that war, the terrible images that exist in a real war. Why is it, do you think, and is it the Chinese again, that the algorithm is full of what's going on in the Middle East, but the Ukraine-Russia war, nothing. No images, no stories about the kids, no stories about the hundreds of thousands of people that are dead.
Yeah, I can't speak to the algorithms and what those systems are doing with regards to that. I can tell you that in addition to what you've just mentioned, I do think that, this is my observation, this war has now lasted longer than the Second World War. I don't want to use the term stalemate, but clearly both sides are trading a kilometer for a kilometer, an incredible death rate. The Russians are losing 5,000 soldiers a week, which is a crazy number. And the Ukrainians are losing people too, but not nearly as many are at the rate. It's sort of a stalemated, stagnated fight that now I think threatens to escalate because we're seeing these deep strikes.
And then the hearing moves to critical minerals, and suddenly the Iran question becomes part of a much bigger Republican argument about strength, independence, and not allowing America's enemies to hold the supply chain hostage.
Mr. Secretary explains it plainly. You can build the greatest car, the greatest plane, the greatest weapon system, and the greatest technology infrastructure in the world. But if one chip, one magnet, one element is missing, the entire thing fails. That is not a technical issue. That is a sovereignty issue. And here again, the choice is obvious.
Republicans are saying America must rebuild its own strength, secure its supply chains, educate the public, and stop acting shocked every time China uses leverage everyone already knew it had. Democrats keep treating industrial weakness like a spreadsheet problem, as if China controlling critical pieces of the global supply chain is just another boring committee topic.
But boring is exactly how national decline hides. It hides in procurement reports. It hides in rare earth minerals. It hides in magnets for cars, chips for technology, parts for defense systems, and one day the American people wake up and realize the country with the biggest speeches does not control the smallest parts. That is the scandal, and that is why this hearing matters.
Because Senator Moskowitz exposed the real test for both parties. Are you willing to measure success by actual results, or are you satisfied with language that sounds responsible while leaving the danger intact?
For me, the answer is clear. A serious country does not outsource its safety to Iran's promises or China's supply chain. A serious country removes the threat, controls the essentials, and tells its own people the truth before the crisis arrives. And then the hearing turns to X country. And this is where the moral temperature changes.
Because Senator Moskowitz points out something that a lot of people feel, but very few people say out loud. The war in Gaza is everywhere, all over the feed, all over the algorithm, all over the campus conversation, all over the emotional bloodstream of American politics, but the ex-country Russia war, with hundreds of thousands dead, with children kidnapped, with families erased, with a European country being chewed apart kilometer by kilometer,
somehow feels like it has been pushed into the shadows. And that does not mean one tragedy matters and another does not.
That is the cheap answer, and we are not doing cheap answers here. The real question is much darker. Who decides which suffering America is allowed to see? Which victims become the center of the screen, and which victims are quietly buried under the next trending outrage?
Senator Moskowitz mentions 25,000 children kidnapped, and if that number does not stop the room cold, then something is broken in the way this country processes moral reality.
Because a kidnapped child is not a foreign policy talking point.
A kidnapped child is not a line item in a military briefing. A kidnapped child is a bedroom left untouched, a mother staring at a phone that will not ring, a father aging 10 years in one winter, a family trapped in the kind of silence no committee can fully measure. And yet somehow those children are not flooding the algorithm. Their faces are not dominating the feed. Their stories are not driving the same daily outrage machine. So again, viewers have to choose what kind of political seriousness they actually believe in. Do you believe the Republican argument that American foreign policy must be anchored in hard reality, national interest, and moral clarity, even when the media gets bored? Or do you believe the Democratic media ecosystem gets to decide which war counts, which victims trend, and which atrocity disappears when it no longer serves the preferred narrative? That is the uncomfortable part.
Because Mr. Secretary does not claim to know exactly what the algorithms are doing, and that is fair.
But he does acknowledge the war has now lasted longer than the Second World War, and that both sides are trading ground at a horrifying cost, with Russia losing around 5,000 soldiers a week, while X country continues bleeding too. Think about that for a second. A war longer than World War II. Thousands dying every week. Deep strikes into Russia raising the risk of escalation. And yet the public attention span has been trained to behave like a broken flashlight, shining brightly on one crisis, then suddenly going dark when the next approved subject arrives. That is not compassion. That is manipulation wearing the mask of compassion.
And this is where the prosecutorial case expands beyond Iran and China.
With Iran, the danger is trusting paper promises.
With China, the danger is outsourcing critical materials. With X country, the danger is outsourcing moral attention to algorithms, activists, and platforms that can make one tragedy feel urgent and another feel invisible.
That is not how a serious country should think. That is not how adults should process war, and it is definitely not how leaders should explain the stakes to the American people.
Because if the public only sees what the algorithm rewards, then public outrage becomes programmable.
If public outrage becomes programmable, then foreign policy becomes emotionally unstable. And if foreign policy becomes emotionally unstable, then enemies do not even need to defeat America directly. They only need to wait for America to lose focus.
This is why the hearing matters far beyond one exchange between Senator Moskowitz and Mr. Secretary.
It exposes a deeper sickness in modern politics. We have more information than any generation in history, but somehow we are easier to distract, easier to steer, easier to exhaust, and easier to divide.
The victims in X country deserve better than that.
The kidnapped children deserve better than that. The American people deserve leaders who can say without apology that moral seriousness cannot depend on whether a tragedy is currently useful to someone's political narrative.
And that is the point Senator Moskowitz is circling around.
A country that cannot see all suffering clearly will eventually be tricked into caring only when powerful people tell it to care. And that brings us to Cuba, where the hearing lands on the oldest question in politics. What happens when a government claims to represent the people, but the system is built to feed the people in power first? Senator Moskowitz thanks the administration for the indictment connected to Raul Castro, and Mr. Secretary immediately corrects the record. It was not simply the administration doing it. A grand jury in South Florida indicted him. That distinction matters. Because in a functioning system, Justice is not supposed to be one powerful person pointing at another powerful person and saying, "Get him." Justice has to move through evidence, procedure, grand juries, courts, and legal responsibility. That is the whole point.
And then Mr. Secretary lays out the real sickness inside Cuba. A military conglomerate controls around 70% of the island's GDP, and the revenue does not properly translate into the treasury or into real benefits for the Cuban people.
Think about how obscene that is. A country can have workers, families, churches, hospitals, children, farmers, and small businesses. But if the economic bloodstream is captured by a military structure, then the people are not living under a normal government. They are living under a locked register. And every time humanitarian aid is mentioned, the same moral trap appears. America wants to help the Cuban people, but that aid cannot be stolen, rerouted, or dumped into regime-controlled dollar stores while ordinary people keep standing in line for survival. That is the final lesson of this entire hearing.
With Iran, do not trust promises when capability remains.
With China, do not brag about strength while depending on your rival for the smallest essential parts.
With X country, do not let algorithms decide which victims deserve public attention.
And with Cuba, do not confuse aid to the people with aid captured by the regime. My personal view is simple. A serious country must stop rewarding systems that survive by hiding the truth behind procedure, slogans, or fake humanitarian language. Law matters. Evidence matters. Verification matters. But moral clarity matters too.
Because if the powerful can keep the uranium, control the minerals, bury the victims, and steal the aid, then what exactly are ordinary people supposed to believe in?
So here's the question. Are we still willing to demand real accountability? Or are we just going to keep applauding speeches while the same dangerous systems keep cashing the check?
Comment your thoughts below. Hit like, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more breakdowns of the hearings they hope you never fully understand.